What if I told you that the oldest continuous civilization on Earth, a civilization that invented paper, gunpowder, the compass, and silk, has been quietly shaping the world for over 5,000 years, and most people don't even know the half of it? This is not just a history lesson. This is the rise and fall of dynasties, the blood of emperors, the whispers of ancient philosophers, and the thunder of armies that moved like oceans across the largest landmass in human history. This is China, and trust me, you've never heard it told like this. Welcome back to History and Mystery, the channel where we dig beneath the surface of history to find the stories that were buried, the conspiracies, the mysteries, the moments that changed the world. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now because we drop content like this every single week. And if you've been here before, you already know we don't do surface level. Today, we are going all the way. From the very first sparks of human life along the Yellow River, through the chaos of warring kingdoms, the iron grip of emperors, the terror of foreign invasions, and all the way into the modern era, we are covering the entire history of China in one video. Grab something to drink. This is going to be a ride. Long before there were emperors or dynasties or great walls, there were people. Human ancestors first appeared in what is now China more than 1 million years ago. We know this because of Peking man, Homo erectus fossils discovered near Beijing in the 1920s, bones that rewrote our understanding of early human migration across Asia. But it was around 10,000 years ago, in the aftermath of the last ice age, when something remarkable began to happen along two great rivers. Along the Yellow River in the north, early communities began farming millet. In the south, along the Yangtze River, they cultivated rice. These weren't just agricultural experiments. They were the foundations of one of the most complex and enduring civilizations our planet has ever seen. By around 5000 BCE, the Yangtze culture was thriving, people living in villages, creating painted pottery, raising pigs and cattle, and burying their dead with ritual objects. And then came the Longshan culture, even more advanced, using potter's wheels and building walled settlements. China was being born brick by brick, field by field, generation by generation. And hovering above all of it, threading through Chinese cultural memory like a golden thread, were the 3 sovereigns and the 5 emperors, mythical rulers who, according to legend, taught humanity to farm, to heal, to govern. Were they real? Were they gods? Were they memories of actual ancient leaders transformed over millennia into something divine? That mystery, even today, has never been fully answered. Around 2070 BCE, according to traditional Chinese historical records, something new emerged. The Xia Dynasty, China's first royal dynasty, was founded by a man named Yu the Great. Yu was celebrated as a hero who tamed the catastrophic floods that had long tormented the Yellow River basin. For years, Western historians dismissed the Xia as mythology. No archaeological proof, no inscriptions, just stories passed down through centuries. But then came the discovery at Erlitou, a sprawling Bronze Age site in Henan province. Palaces, bronze artifacts, evidence of a complex hierarchical society dating to roughly the period when the Xia was supposed to have existed. The debate is still alive, still fierce, still fascinating. But whether the Xia dynasty was fully historical or partly legendary, one thing is certain: it planted the idea that has guided China ever since. The idea that heaven itself grants rulers the right to govern, and that this mandate, this divine authority, can be won or lost based on how justly a ruler leads. That concept, the mandate of heaven, would echo through every dynasty that came after, for thousands of years. Around 1600 BCE, a new power rose from the ruins of the Xia, the Shang dynasty, and this one we know was real because they left us something extraordinary: oracle bones. The Shang kings would take the shoulder blades of oxen or the shells of turtles, carve questions into them, apply heat until cracks appeared, and then read those cracks as answers from the ancestors and gods. These bones survive, tens of thousands of them. And the writing on them, early Chinese script, is among the oldest writing systems ever discovered, still in active use in a modern language. The Shang built cities with massive walls, cast stunning bronze vessels, and traded across vast distances. They were sophisticated, artistic, and deeply spiritual. They were also brutal. Human sacrifice was common. Slaves were buried alive with their masters. War captives were ritually killed. This was a society that believed the dead needed to be fed and honored, and they took that belief to terrifying extremes. Around 1046 BCE, a western state called Zhou rose up and overthrew the last Shang king. According to legend, that king was a tyrant, a monster who threw people into pits of snakes and who threw parties while his kingdom burned. Whether the propaganda was exaggerated or true, the Zhou made sure everyone knew why the Shang deserved to fall. And in doing so, they formalized the mandate of heaven as a political and moral doctrine for the very first time. The Zhou dynasty lasted longer than any other in Chinese history, over 800 years, from 1046 BCE to 256 BCE. But it was not a peaceful 800 years, not even close. The Zhou began in what historians call the Western Zhou period, a time of relative stability when the Zhou kings distributed land to loyal nobles, creating a feudal system not unlike medieval Europe. But as the centuries passed, those nobles grew powerful. Dangerously powerful. By 771 BCE, the Zhou capital had been sacked by invaders and the royal court was forced to flee east, beginning what's called the Eastern Zhou period, and within that, two of the most turbulent eras in all of Chinese history, the Spring and Autumn period and the Warring States period. During the Spring and Autumn period, hundreds of small states competed, schemed, allied, and fought. It was chaos dressed up in ceremony and ritual. And it was in the middle of this chaos, around 551 BCE, that a man was born who would change the world more profoundly than almost any emperor who ever lived. His name was Conquest. You know him as Confucius. Confucius watched the chaos around him and asked a simple question: how do we build a good society? His answer was relationships, between ruler and subject, between parent and child, between husband and wife, between older and younger sibling, between friends. Respect those relationships, honor those duties, cultivate virtue, and society would flourish. His ideas were largely ignored during his lifetime, but after his death, Confucianism became the philosophical backbone of Chinese civilization for over 2,000 years, and he wasn't alone. This era produced an explosion of philosophical thought: Taoism, legalism, Moism, a moment so intellectually rich that historians call it the 100 schools of thought. Meanwhile, the Warring States period from 475 to 221 BCE saw 7 major kingdoms locked in total war. State after state fell, millions died, and from the blood and fire of that catastrophe emerged one man who would finally end the chaos and change China forever. His name was Yingzheng, and he became king of the Qin state at just 13 years old. By 38, he had conquered all 7 kingdoms, unified China for the first time in history, and given himself a title no one had ever used before: Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. What he accomplished in just 11 years of rule is almost incomprehensible. He standardized the Chinese writing system, so people across the vast empire could communicate. He standardized weights, measures, and currency. He built thousands of miles of roads and canals. He connected and extended existing walls into what would eventually become known as the Great Wall of China, and he ruled with absolute terrifying power. Under his chief minister Li Si and the philosophy of legalism, every aspect of life was regulated. Punishments were brutal. Dissent was not tolerated. In one infamous episode, he ordered hundreds of Confucian scholars buried alive and their books burned, an act of cultural violence designed to erase the old thinking and replace it with his own. He was also obsessed with immortality. He sent ships across the sea to find the elixir of eternal life. He consumed mercury in pills given to him by alchemists who promised it would make him live forever. It killed him instead. He died in 210 BCE at just 49 years old. And buried with him, in one of the most astonishing archaeological discoveries in history, was an army. Over 8,000 terracotta soldiers, horses, and chariots, life-sized, each with unique faces, standing guard in the earth for over 2,000 years. The first emperor was gone, but his legacy, permanent. The Qin Dynasty collapsed almost immediately after the first emperor's death. Within just 4 years, rebellions tore it apart. From the ruins rose the Han Dynasty, founded in 206 BCE by Liu Bang, a former peasant who became one of history's greatest underdogs. The Han would rule China with one brief interruption for over 400 years, and during that time, China became a superpower. Under Emperor Wu, who ruled from 141 to 87 BCE, the Han expanded aggressively into Central Asia, into Korea, into Vietnam. They crushed the Xiongnu nomads of the north in decades of brutal warfare. They opened the Silk Road, the ancient trade network that would connect China to Rome, to Persia, to India, carrying silk, spices, ideas, and disease across thousands of miles of desert and mountain. Confucianism became official state doctrine. A civil service examination system, the first in the world, was created, allowing talented men of any class to rise through government based on merit, not birth. Paper was invented. The seismograph was invented. The water wheel, the foot stirrup. The Han era was an explosion of human ingenuity, but even golden ages end. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, the Han Dynasty was collapsing under the weight of corruption, peasant revolts, and the terrifying Yellow Turban Rebellion, a massive uprising driven by a Taoist religious sect that believed a new golden age was coming. The Han held on, fractured and diminished, until 220 CE, when it finally shattered into 3 competing kingdoms. China entered one of its most romantic and violent eras. The Three Kingdoms period, Wei, Wu, and Shu, is one of the most beloved chapters in all of Chinese history, immortalized centuries later in the epic novel romance of the Three Kingdoms. It was an era of brilliant military strategists, tragic loyalties, and legendary warriors. It was also an era of mass death. Scholars estimate that the population of China fell from roughly 60 million at the height of the Han to just 16 million by the time the Three Kingdoms period ended. Warlords, plagues, and famine consumed a generation. After the Three Kingdoms came a succession of short-lived dynasties and a fragmented era called the Six Dynasties period, then the Qin, then the chaotic 16 Kingdoms. China fractured and stitched back together repeatedly, like a body that refused to die. Then came the Sui dynasty in 581 CE, brief but transformative. Sui Emperor Yangdi, a tyrant by most accounts, overextended China in catastrophic military campaigns and worked his people to death building the Grand Canal, a massive waterway connecting northern and southern China that would remain crucial for over 1,000 years. His excesses triggered revolts that destroyed the Sui, but the Grand Canal remained, and rising from the Sui's ashes came what many consider the greatest dynasty in Chinese history, the Tang. The Tang dynasty, from 618 to 907 CE, was China at its most cosmopolitan, most confident, most creative. The capital, Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an, was the largest city on earth, with over 1 million people, a bustling international hub where Persian merchants, Japanese scholars, Indian monks, and Central Asian musicians walked the same streets. Tang poetry is still considered the pinnacle of Chinese literary achievement. Block printing was developed, making books cheaper and more available. And then a historical first that still astonishes: China was ruled by a woman. Wu Zetian, the only woman in Chinese history to assume the title of Empress Regnant, seized power, held it for 15 years, and by most accounts governed effectively, even brilliantly, though her methods could be ruthless. The Tang eventually weakened, fell apart, and gave way to a brief chaotic period, before a new dynasty unified China once more. The Song dynasty, from 960 to 1279 CE, was China at its most inventive. Gunpowder weapons were developed. Movable type printing was invented by Bai Sheng 400 years before Gutenberg. Paper money was used for the first time in history. The magnetic compass was refined for navigation. The Song had the most advanced economy in the world, with international trade networks reaching Africa and the Middle East. But the Song had a problem. They were surrounded by enemies. To the north, a series of powerful nomadic and semi-nomadic states, the Liao, the Jin, the Xia, pressured the empire relentlessly. The Song paid enormous tribute in silk and silver to keep the peace. And then from the steppes of Central Asia came something no tribute could stop: the Mongols. Under Genghis Khan and then his grandson Kublai Khan, the Mongols swept across the known world in the most devastating military conquest in history. Over 8,000 they destroyed the Qin dynasty. They burned cities. They massacred populations. And in 1279, after decades of brutal warfare, Kublai Khan completed the conquest of China, establishing the Yuan dynasty, the first time China had been ruled entirely by a foreign power. The Mongol Empire at its height was the largest contiguous land empire in history, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. China was its crown jewel. And yet, even under Mongol rule, trade flourished. The Silk Road reached its peak, and a young Venetian merchant named Marco Polo arrived at the court of Kublai Khan and went home with stories so incredible that half of Europe refused to believe him. The Mongols were overthrown in 1368 by a peasant rebellion led by a man named Zhu Yuanzhang, the son of a poor farmer, a former orphan and wandering Buddhist monk who became the founding emperor of the Ming dynasty. His story alone could fill an entire video, and maybe it will. The Ming was a dynasty of extraordinary ambition and extraordinary contradiction. Early Ming emperors rebuilt and expanded the Great Wall into the iconic structure we recognize today. They constructed the Forbidden City in Beijing, a vast palace complex of nearly 1,000 buildings, built by 1 million workers over 14 years, that served as the imperial home for 24 emperors across 5 centuries. And then there were the voyages of Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch admiral who commanded the largest fleet the world had ever seen, sailing to Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and the coast of East Africa, decades before Columbus stumbled across the Americas. These were not just trade missions. They were displays of Chinese power, generosity, and reach. And then, for reasons still debated by historians, China stopped. The voyages ended. The ships were burned or left to rot. China turned inward, closing its borders to foreign trade, suspicious of outside influence. It was a decision with enormous consequences. While China looked inward, Europe looked outward, and the age of Western exploration and colonialism began. The Ming continued for nearly 3 centuries, producing magnificent art, literature, and philosophy, but growing more rigid, more isolated, more vulnerable. By the early 1600s, crop failures, peasant rebellions, and relentless pressure from nomadic groups to the north were tearing the empire apart. And in 1644, an army from Manchuria, the Jurchen people, marched through the Great Wall and toppled the Ming. China had a new dynasty, again foreign, again world-changing. The Qing dynasty, ruled by the Manchu people from the northeast, would be the last imperial dynasty in Chinese history. At its height in the 18th century, the Qing Empire was one of the largest and most powerful states on earth, ruling over China, Mongolia, Tibet, Xinjiang, and much of Central Asia. Qing emperors like Kangxi and Qianlong were remarkable rulers, patrons of art and scholarship, administrators of vast complexity, conquerors who expanded China's territory to its greatest extent ever. For much of the 1700s, China's economy was the largest in the world, accounting for roughly a third of global GDP. But the 19th century brought catastrophe. First came the Opium Wars. British merchants had been selling opium grown in India to Chinese consumers, creating a mass addiction crisis, and when the Qing government tried to stop it, Britain went to war to protect its drug trade. China lost, and in the humiliating treaties that followed, China was forced to open ports to foreign trade, hand over Hong Kong to Britain, and pay massive reparations. It was a shock to a civilization that had long considered itself the center of the world. Then came the Taiping Rebellion, one of the deadliest conflicts in all of human history. A man named Han Dynasty, who believed he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, led a massive uprising that lasted from 1850 to 1864 and killed an estimated 20 to 30 million people, more than died in the First World War. The Qing survived, barely, but they were weakened, humiliated, and increasingly unable to deal with the forces reshaping the modern world. Japan, China's neighbor and longtime cultural student, had modernized rapidly after the Meiji Restoration. In 1894, Japan defeated China in war and seized Taiwan and Korea. The shock was profound. How had a country that had once been a relative backwater overtaken the Middle Kingdom? Reformers inside China pushed for change. The Empress Dowager Cixi, perhaps the most powerful woman in Chinese history since Wu Zetian, who ruled from behind the throne for decades, sometimes supported reform and sometimes brutally suppressed it. In 1900, the Boxer Rebellion, a violent anti-foreign uprising, resulted in foreign armies marching into Beijing. China was carved up into spheres of influence by Western powers and Japan. The Qing were finished. In 1911, revolution finally came. Led by Sun Yat-sen, Chinese republicans overthrew the last Qing emperor, a 6-year-old boy named Puyi, and declared a republic. 5,000 years of imperial rule were over, and the chaos that followed would be unlike anything China had ever seen. The Republic of China that was proclaimed in 1912 was more of an idea than a functioning state. The country fragmented almost immediately. Warlords seized provinces. Foreign powers maintained their privileges. Sun Yat-sen struggled to build something from the rubble. Then came the First World War, and then the May 4th movement of 1919, a great wave of nationalism, fueled by outrage when China's contribution to the Allied cause was rewarded at the Paris Peace Conference by handing Germany's concessions in China to Japan instead of returning them to the Chinese people. Young Chinese intellectuals turned to radical ideas. Some turned to communism. Mao Zedong was one of them. The 1920s brought an uneasy alliance between the Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, and the newly formed Chinese Communist Party. Together they attempted to reunify China and crush the warlords. But in 1927, nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek turned on the communists in a brutal purge, killing thousands. Civil war erupted, and then came Japan. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China, beginning the Second Sino-Japanese War, which merged into the larger catastrophe of World War II. The Nanjing Massacre, where Japanese forces killed an estimated 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners in 6 weeks, became one of the defining horrors of the 20th century. China fought Japan for 8 years, bleeding, devastated, held together by sheer will. When Japan surrendered in 1945, China got no peace. The civil war between communists and nationalists resumed immediately. 4 years of brutal fighting ended in 1949 when Mao Zedong stood in Tiananmen Square in Beijing and proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists fled to the island of Taiwan. China was divided, and that division has never fully been resolved. The People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong was a state of enormous transformation and enormous suffering. Land was redistributed, industry was nationalized, women were granted new legal rights, literacy rates climbed, but Mao's campaigns also brought catastrophe. The Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 1962 was an attempt to industrialize China overnight and transform its agriculture through collectivization. It was a disaster of historic proportions. Famine caused by disastrous agricultural policies, local officials lying about production numbers, and the forced requisitioning of grain from starving rural communities, killed somewhere between 15 and 55 million people. It was one of the deadliest famines in human history. And then came the Cultural Revolution, from 1966 to 1976, a terrifying decade during which Mao unleashed the Red Guards, young ideological fanatics who attacked teachers, burned books, demolished historical sites, humiliated intellectuals, and tore China's cultural fabric to shreds. Anyone accused of being counter-revolutionary could be persecuted, imprisoned, or killed. Millions suffered. Mao died in 1976, and the radicals who had led the Cultural Revolution, the Gang of Four, including Mao's widow, were arrested. China was exhausted, traumatized, and economically left behind. Then came Deng Xiaoping. Deng was a pragmatist, a man who had survived the Cultural Revolution's purges. Under his leadership from the late 1970s onward, China began the most dramatic economic transformation in human history. Special economic zones were opened. Foreign investment was welcomed. State enterprises were reformed. China's economy grew at rates the world had never seen for decades. Hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty. Cities transformed overnight. By the early 21st century, China had become the world's second-largest economy and was closing in on the first. The 2008 Beijing Olympics announced China's return to the world stage in dazzling fashion. Under President Xi Jinping, who came to power in 2012 and consolidated authority unlike any leader since Mao, China has grown more assertive in the South China Sea, in its claims over Taiwan, in its global investment through the Belt and Road Initiative. China today is not just a country. It is a civilizational force reshaping the world. 5,000 years, that's what we've just traveled through together. From the first farmers along the Yellow River to the gleaming skylines of Shanghai and Shenzhen. From oracle bones and terracotta armies to nuclear weapons and space stations. From Confucius to Mao. From the Great Wall to the Great Firewall. China's history is not a straight line, it is a spiral, cycling through unity and division, glory and catastrophe, openness and... China's history is not a straight line, it is a spiral, cycling through unity and division, glory and catastrophe, openness and isolation again and again, each time emerging transformed but recognizably, undeniably itself. That is what makes China's story so staggering. Not just its age, not just its scale, but its endurance. Every other civilization that existed in 3000 BCE is gone, their language is dead, their culture's dust, their peoples absorbed into something else entirely. China is still here, writing in a script descended from those earliest oracle bones, governed by ideas rooted in philosophers who walked its soil 2,500 years ago, eating cuisine with roots stretching back millennia, arguing internally and with the world about what China is, what it means, and what it should become. That argument is still going. It may never be fully resolved, and that might be the most fascinating mystery of all. If you made it this far, I want to hear from you in the comments. Which dynasty or era surprised you the most? Which story do you want us to dig deeper into? The Cultural Revolution, the Opium Wars, the mystery of Qin Shi Huang's tomb, which still hasn't been fully excavated. Tell me below, your comments genuinely shape what we make next. And if you got value from this video, please subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the bell so you never miss an episode. Share this with someone who loves history, or with someone who thinks they don't, because I promise, after watching this, they will. I'm your host on History and Mystery, and I'll see you in the next one.